Location: the skies above northwestern North Korea. MiG Alley, November 1950. It is the morning of November 8, 1950, a date that would forever change aerial warfare. The air temperature above the Yalu River hovers at minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Frost clings to the cockpit glass of Lieutenant Russell Brown as his F-86 shooting star streaks northward over the jagged Korean peninsula. Then, from out of nowhere, a swept-wing silhouette tears through the clouds at speeds no American pilot has ever witnessed in combat. It is a MiG-15 flown by a Soviet pilot, and it moves like lightning through a gray sky. The world's first jet versus jet dogfight is about to begin, and nobody, not Washington, not Moscow, not even the pilots themselves, is fully prepared for what comes next. Before we go further, ask yourself this. Asterisk, what does it take to dominate the skies when your enemy is just as fast, just as deadly, and fighting on home turf? MiG Alley was not a place marked on any official map. It was a name born from fear, adrenaline, and necessity, coined by American pilots who flew missions over the narrow corridor of airspace stretching from the town of Sinuiju in the west to Suho in the east, running along the Yalu River that separated North Korea from Chinese Manchuria. By late October 1950, Soviet MiG-15 jets, secretly based across the Chinese border in airfields at Antung and Mukden, began appearing in Korean skies in numbers that stunned UN commanders. These were not inexperienced flyers. Many of the Soviet pilots were veterans of World War II, decorated heroes of the Eastern Front who had tangled with Nazi Messerschmitts and lived. The geography of MiG Alley was a tactical nightmare for American pilots. They could chase a MiG right to the Yalu River, but could not cross it without triggering an international incident. The Soviets knew this, and they exploited every single inch of that invisible boundary with ruthless precision. To understand why American pilots were suddenly struggling for their lives over Korea, we must travel back to Moscow in the years immediately following World War II. In late 1946, Soviet engineers at the McCoy-Gurevich Design Bureau, the men behind the famous MiG designation, began work on a radical new jet fighter. They had one critical advantage: captured German aeronautical research, including swept-wing technology developed by engineers at the Focke-Wulf Company. Even more remarkably, British Prime Minister Clement Attlee's government, in a stunning act of post-war goodwill, sold the Soviets 55 Rolls-Royce Nene turbojet engines in 1947. The Soviets copied those engines, reverse-engineered them with breathtaking speed, and installed them in the new MiG-15. The result was a fighter that could climb at 3,940 feet per minute, reach a ceiling of 50,000 feet, and cruise comfortably at over 600 miles per hour. When it first appeared over Korea, American F-86 shooting stars and B-29 Superfortress bombers were simply outclassed. The question now was, could America find an answer, and could find one fast enough? America's answer to MiG-15 came not from a sudden wartime invention, but from a design already under development. The F-86 Sabre was born at North American Aviation's plant in Inglewood, California, where chief designer Edgar Schmud and his team had studied the same captured German swept-wing research. The Sabre's 35-degree swept wing gave a sleek, predatory look and terrifying performance characteristics. By the time the first F-86 has arrived in Korea in December 1950, the aircraft could fly at Mach 0.87, nearly the speed of sound, and was armed with 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns capable of firing 1,200 rounds per minute combined. Colonel John C. Meyer, one of America's top aces from World War II who helped transition pilots onto the Sabre, reportedly told his men, "Gentlemen, this aircraft does not forgive mistakes, but it rewards courage beyond anything you have ever flown." The Sabre was beautiful, dangerous, and exactly what the Air Force needed. But machine is only as good as a man in the cockpit, and now the question becomes personal. Who were the men sent to fly it into MiG Alley? On December 17, 1950, the 4th Fighter Interceptor Wing landed at Kimpo Air Base just outside Seoul in a swirl of frozen mud and jet exhaust. These were not green recruits. The 4th Wing was populated with veterans, men who had flown P-51 Mustangs over Nazi Germany, men who carried the memories of friends shot down over the English Channel and Pacific. Among them was Lieutenant Colonel Bruce Hinton, a quiet, methodical Texan with sharp eyes and a pilot's economy of emotion. On December 17, 1950, the very day the wing arrived, Hinton led a patrol north toward the Yalu. At approximately 2:30 p.m. local time, four MiG-15s appeared at 30,000 feet, dropping from the sun like silver knives. Hinton stayed cool. He throttled up, pulled into a climbing turn, cut off the trailing MiG, and fired a burst from the 650s. The MiG exploded. It was the first F-86 kill of the Korean War. Hinton landed back at Kimpo, climbed out of the cockpit, and reportedly said nothing. He simply lit a cigarette and looked back at the sky. Asterisk what drives a man to calmly chase death at 600 miles per hour? And what did it feel like knowing your enemy was just as skilled and just as human as you? Here's a secret that both sides kept for decades. The MiGs over Korea were not being flown by Chinese or North Korean pilots. At least not primarily. They were flown by Soviet Air Force pilots, ordered to wear Chinese uniforms and forbidden from flying over the front lines or over the sea where they might be captured. The operation was known internally as Operatia Udar, Operation Strike. At the controls were some of the most decorated Soviet airmen alive. Colonel Yevgeny Popeliev, a World War II veteran and one of the top Soviet aces in Korea, flew from Anton with the 196th Fighter Aviation Regiment. He later recalled in a 1990 interview after Soviet secrecy was lifted, asterisk, we knew they were Americans. We could sometimes hear their radio chatter. They were brave, very brave, but we were ready for them. Asterisk Popeliev would go on to claim 23 aerial victories over Korea, a staggering number that remained classified until fall of the Soviet Union. These men were not baffled at first. They were confident. They had a faster climbing aircraft, home field advantage, and decades of combat experience. The bafflement came later, when, time and again, the Sabres refused to die. By the spring of 1951, MiG Alley had become the most dangerous piece of sky on Earth. On April 22, 1951, in a single day of intense combat, over 70 MiG-15s crossed the Yalu and engaged American Sabres in a rolling, chaotic series of dogfights that lasted from mid-morning until late afternoon. The Americans were outnumbered, often 3-1, sometimes 5-1. Soviet pilots pressed their numerical and altitude advantage aggressively, diving from above 50,000 feet in coordinated pairs. Yet the kill ratios told a confusing story from Moscow. Despite superior numbers and a faster climbing aircraft, Soviet pilots were losing Sabres at a ratio they had not anticipated. Captain James Jabara, a World War II veteran from Wichita, Kansas, shot down his 5th and 6th MiGs on May 20, 1951, becoming America's first jet ace in history. He was 27 years old, barely a decade removed from high school in Kansas. His squadron mates described him as asterisk, wiry, intense, and absolutely without fear in the air. Asterisk Jabari himself said after his 6th kill, asterisk, the MiG can outclimb me and out-ceiling me, but I can out-turn him, and in a turning fight, I own the sky. Asterisk in that viewers was the key. Asterisk, but how did American pilots discover that secret? And why didn't the Soviets adapt faster? The F-86 Sabre had one critical disadvantage against the MiG-15. In a straight climb or a zoom to high altitude, the Soviet jet was superior. The MiG could reach 50,000 feet, while most Sabres struggled past 45,000. It could accelerate faster in the initial stages of a fight. On paper, it should have won more often. But paper does not fly at 600 miles per hour in minus 40-degree temperatures with Soviet ace on your tail. American pilots discovered, through blood, loss, and hard-won experience, that the Sabre's hydraulically boosted flight controls gave a decisive edge at transonic speeds. When both jets entered a turning engagement, the Sabre could sustain tighter turns at high speed without the controls becoming dangerously heavy and sluggish, a problem that afflicted the MiG at speeds above Mach 0.85. Additionally, the Sabre featured a gyroscopic gun sight, the A1CM, that calculated lead angles automatically, giving pilots a crucial fraction of a second advantage in lining up a kill shot. One veteran Sabre pilot, Major Frederick Boots Bless, wrote in his famous tactical manual, No Guts, No Glory, published in 1955. Asterisk, a fighter pilot must possess an inner urge to do his job better than any other man in the world. Asterisk, Bless himself became an ace with 10 kills. His tactics manual became required reading for every pilot who flew over Korea. If you're fascinated by how tactics and technology intersect in the heat of battle, subscribe now for more videos like this one. We go deep so you don't miss a thing. Behind every aerial kill statistic is a human being sitting in a cold barracks room, writing letters home he hopes will never be the last. At Kimpo Air Base, the officers' mess was a place of peculiar normalcy in the middle of extraordinary danger. Pilots played cards, argued about baseball, and ate powdered eggs with the studied casualness of men who refused to admit they were afraid. But fear was always there, in the way a pilot's hand shook slightly before mission briefing, in the silence that fell over a table when someone didn't come back. Captain Manuel Pete Fernandez, a Cuban-American from Miami, who would eventually become the third-ranking American ace of the war with 14.5 kills, described the emotional weight of combat flying in a 1953 interview. Asterisk, every morning I walked that jet, I told myself it was just another day at work. But my stomach knew different. Your stomach always knows. Asterisk losses hit hard. On January 14, 1952, Lieutenant Colonel George Davis, already an ace with 7 kills, was shot down and killed after attacking a formation of 12 MiGs alone to protect his wingmen. He was posthumously awarded the Medal of Honor. Davis was 31 years old. His wife, Doris, received the news of their home in Lubbock, Texas, on a gray January afternoon. Asterisk, how do you measure the cost of air superiority? Is it in kill ratios or in empty chairs? Asterisk, by mid-1952, a quiet frustration was beginning to spread through the ranks of the Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps. The officers who had arrived in Manchuria supremely confident, veterans of Stalingrad, Kursk, and Berlin, were struggling to explain why their kill claims did not match the kill ratios being reported by American sources. Soviet pilots reported downing dozens of Sabres per month. American records showed far fewer losses. Part of this was a universal fog of war, both sides overclaimed in the chaos of high-speed jet combat, where a smoking enemy might limp home rather than crash. But something deeper was troubling Soviet commanders. Lieutenant General Georgy Lobov, who took command of the 64th Corps in mid-1952, was a meticulous and serious officer who studied every engagement report with careful attention. He later wrote in his memoirs, asterisk, we had the better aircraft in many respects, but the Americans had something we struggled to quantify, an aggression, a willingness to press the attack at close range that cost us more than our aircraft advantages could compensate for. Asterisk Lobov ordered new training programs, new formation tactics, new approaches to the high-altitude ambush. But the Sabres kept coming, and the pilots flying them kept getting better. Asterisk, so what was really going on inside the cockpit that gave American pilots the psychological edge? Stay with us. If there was one factor that consistently separated American Sabre pilots from their Soviet opponents over MiG Alley, it was not the aircraft, it was training. At Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada, the Air Force had developed an aggressive, realistic training program that pushed pilots through simulated combat scenarios, instrument flying in low visibility, and gunnery training at high speed. Pilots arrived in Korea having already practiced the exact maneuvers they would need to survive. By contrast, Soviet pilots, while brave and experienced, were often hampered by a training culture that emphasized adherence to formation and command rather than individual initiative. American pilots were taught to think in the cockpit, to adapt, to break formation when the situation demanded it. Colonel Francis Gabby Gabreski, a legendary World War II ace commanding the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing in Korea, put bluntly in a 1952 briefing, asterisk, the difference between a live pilot and a dead one is about 2 seconds and one good decision. We train for those 2 seconds every single day. Asterisk Gabreski had survived World War II with 28 aerial victories. His words carried the absolute authority of someone who had stared death down from a cockpit and lived to teach others how to do the same. American individual initiative in the air was creating a generation of pilots the Soviets had not anticipated and could not easily replicate. One of the most remarkable and least discussed advantages American pilots held over MiG Alley was invisible electronic intelligence gathering. Beginning in late 1951, modified RB-29 aircraft, designated on a classified program known as Casey Jones, flew high-altitude orbits over the Sea of Japan, intercepting Soviet radio communications from the 64th Corps. These listening platforms recorded Soviet pilots' voices, tracked their radio procedures, mapped their communication frequencies, and, crucially, gave American intelligence officers a window into Soviet tactics and formation procedures before engagements. This intelligence was distilled into mission briefings for Sabre pilots, warning them of MiG formations assembling on the far side of the Yalu before those MiGs even crossed into Korean airspace. The Soviets used relatively unsophisticated radio procedures and often communicated in the clear, assuming their Manchurian bases were beyond American reach. They were wrong. By the time a Soviet formation of 40 MiGs lifted off from Antung, American controllers at mosquito control stations in South Korea sometimes already knew their altitude, direction, and rough numbers. This was an intelligence edge the Soviet pilots could not see, could not combat, and, for most of the war, did not even know existed. Asterisk history is rarely just about what happens in the sky. It's about what happens on the ground in the shadows. And that's exactly where Part 2 takes us. Don't go anywhere. Asterisk. Numbers can tell stories, and they can lie. Throughout the Korean War, the United States Air Force maintained and publicized an astonishing kill ratio against MiG-15s in the Sabre versus MiG engagements, at various points claiming a ratio of 10-1 in America's favor. For every 10 MiGs destroyed, the claim went, only one Sabre was lost. In Washington, this ratio was celebrated, publicized in newspapers, and used as evidence of American air power superiority. But historians who gained access to Soviet and Russian archives after 1991 have painted a considerably more complex picture. Russian records suggest the true ratio was likely closer to 2 to 1, or perhaps 3 to 1 in America's favor. Still a meaningful advantage, but not the lopsided dominance American press releases suggested. Part of the discrepancy comes from overclaiming on both sides. Part comes from the fact that many damaged MiGs made it back across the Yalu and were not counted as losses by American pilots who only saw them smoking and diving away. General Matthew Ridgway, commanding UN forces in 1952, wrote in a classified memo, asterisk, "Our air superiority over MiG Alley is real, but we must not allow the numbers game to blind us to the genuine capability and courage of our opponents." Asterisk, asterisk, here's your question for the comments section. Do you think kill ratios tell the full story of who won the air war over Korea? Let us know below. By the closing months of 1952, MiG Alley had become the defining contest of the early Cold War in the air. It was no longer simply about Korea, about hills and rivers and frozen ridgelines where infantry traded artillery fire in the dark. It was about something larger, which superpowers' air force could dominate the sky of the future. Every MiG that fell to Sabre's guns was a message to Moscow. Every Sabre that tumbled flaming into the Korean hillsides was a message to Washington. The pilots on both sides felt this weight, even if they rarely spoke of it. They were young men, in their mid to late 20s mostly, asked to be the sharp edge of a geopolitical contest that neither side dared escalate into open nuclear confrontation. Captain Joseph McConnell, a 29-year-old former navigator from Dover, New Hampshire, who had never flown fighters until after World War II, was about to enter the skies over MiG Alley and do something no American had done before, something that would shake Soviet confidence to its foundation. But that story belongs to Part 2. Asterisk hit subscribe right now, so you don't miss it. Part 2 drops soon, and trust us, what happens next will absolutely stun you. What do you think gave American pilots the real edge, the aircraft, the training, or something else entirely? Drop your answer in the comments. Location: MiG Alley, northwestern Korea, early 1953. Welcome back. If you are just joining us, make sure you watch Part 1 first. The link is right above. In Part 1, we trace the birth of MiG Alley, introduce the remarkable machines and remarkable men who filled that frozen sky with fire, and began to understand why Soviet pilots, despite flying a technically impressive aircraft, could not achieve the dominance they expected. Now, in Part 2, we arrive at the final act, the months when American Sabre pilots pushed their advantage to its absolute limit, when individual heroism became strategic impact, and when the Soviet Air Force found itself asking questions it could not answer. We are in early 1953. The Korean armistice negotiations at Panmunjom have been grinding along since July 1951. 18 agonizing months of diplomatic stalemate, while men continue to die. In the air, however, there is no stalemate. The pace of aerial combat is actually intensifying as both sides sense the war is approaching its end. Soviet commanders push their pilots harder. American commanders respond in kind. And into this pressure cooker steps one of the most unlikely aces in American history, a man who would deliver the single most stunning individual performance over MiG Alley. Asterisk, are you ready? Because this is where the story truly explodes. Asterisk. Captain Joseph McConnell Jr. arrived at the 51st Fighter Interceptor Wing at Kimpo Air Base in January 1953 with a history that should have disqualified him from becoming a fighter ace. During World War II, McConnell had served as a navigator on B-24 bombers, not a fighter pilot at all. He had lobbied, pleaded, and pulled every string available to get into a fighter cockpit, finally transitioning to jets after the war. By the time he arrived in Korea, he was 29 years old, older than most of his fellow pilots, considered by some to be too old for the demanding physical and mental rigors of jet combat in MiG Alley. His wife, Pearl, waiting at their small home in Apple Valley, California, wrote him letters every week without fail, signing each one, asterisk, come home to me. That's the only mission that matters. Asterisk McConnell carried her photograph in the breast pocket of his flight suit on every mission. He was not a flashy man. He did not drink heavily in the officer's mess or boast about his flying. He was quiet, technically meticulous, and possessed of a terrifying patience in the cockpit, the patience of a man who has spent years as a navigator learning to wait for exactly the right moment. Over MiG Alley, that patience was about to become the most dangerous weapon in the sky. Asterisk, what do you think? Does age and experience give a combat pilot an edge, or does youth and reflexes matter more? Tell us in the comments. Asterisk. Between February and May 1953, Joseph McConnell flew mission after mission into MiG Alley with a focus and ferocity that left his squadron mates shaking their heads. On February 16, 1953, he shot down his 5th MiG, becoming an ace. On March 19th, he was hit by enemy fire, bailed out over the Yellow Sea, and was rescued by a helicopter, then went straight back to flying the next day. On April 12, 1953, McConnell shot down 3 MiGs in a single mission, a feat so extraordinary that even hardened veterans at the 51st Wing stopped what they were doing to shake his hand. His technique was studied and precise. He flew his Sabre in close, dangerously close, within 1,000 feet of his target, to ensure his 6.50 caliber guns could not miss. Soviet pilots, accustomed to Americans engaging at longer ranges, were horrified to find a Sabre almost on their tail, filling their mirror with the flicker of muzzle flash. Major Boris Abakumov, a Soviet pilot who survived an engagement with McConnell in April 1953, reportedly said after the war, asterisk, he flew as if he had no fear of the guns on my aircraft. That kind of man is the most dangerous thing in the air. Asterisk, by May 18, 1953, Joseph McConnell had 16 confirmed aerial victories, making him the top American ace of the Korean War, and the top jet ace in American history at the time. He was 29 years old, a former navigator from New Hampshire. Nobody saw that coming. the success of pilots like McConnell, Fernandez, and Jabbar was not going unnoticed in Antung. Lieutenant General Georgy Lobov, commanding the Soviet 64th Corps, was an intelligent and intellectually honest officer, and by spring 1953 he was deeply troubled. The pattern was undeniable. Soviet pilots engaging American Sabres in turning dogfights were losing at rates that could not be explained simply by aircraft performance differences. In a series of classified reports sent to Moscow in March and April 1953, Lobov outlined what he believed were the core problems facing Soviet pilots in MiG Alley. First, American pilots demonstrated far greater willingness to press attacks at dangerously close range, inside the envelope where the MiG's superior speed became irrelevant. Second, American formation discipline collapsed rapidly in combat, and this was actually an advantage, because American pilots then fought as skilled individuals rather than waiting for formation commands. Third, and perhaps most difficult to address, American pilots had vastly more total flying hours, and a confidence bore that experience that translated directly into combat effectiveness. Lobov recommended pulling veteran Soviet regiments from the line and replacing them with fresh units to give experienced men time to rest and absorb lessons. Moscow responded slowly. The war was nearly over, and time, as always in war, was the one resource that could never be replaced. Subscribe for more videos. This is the kind of deep history that most channels never touch. To truly understand why MiG Alley mattered, why both sides were willing to risk their finest pilots in that frozen strip of sky, we must understand the B-29 Superfortress crisis of 1951. The B-29 was America's strategic bombing workhorse, the same aircraft that had dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. In Korea, B-29s were being used for conventional strategic bombing of North Korean industrial targets, bridges, and supply lines. But the arrival of MiG-15s changed everything. On October 23, 1951, a day that came to be known as Black Tuesday among bomber crews, a formation of 8 B-29s was intercepted by approximately 150 MiG-15s over the Namsi airfield in northwestern North Korea. In the furious running battle that followed, 3 B-29s were shot down, 5 were severely damaged, and 55 crewmen were killed or captured. It was the single worst day for American strategic bombing since World War II. General Hoyt Vandenberg, Air Force Chief of Staff, said bluntly in a classified briefing, the MiG-15 has made daylight strategic bombing over northwestern Korea prohibitive without adequate fighter escort. The B-29s were pulled from daytime raids. This was the moment that crystallized why Sabre superiority over MiG Alley was not merely a matter of pride. It was strategic necessity. Without the Sabres, the entire air campaign was in jeopardy. Does that change how you see the pilots of MiG Alley? Let us know below. One of the most bitter controversies of the Korean Air War, one that angered American pilots for decades, was the policy of the Manchurian Sanctuary. American pilots were strictly forbidden from crossing the Yalu River in pursuit of MiGs. The Soviet bases at Antung, Mukden, and Tatunku were completely off-limits. MiG pilots could disengage from a losing fight simply by pulling hard north, crossing the Yalu at 600 miles per hour, and landing safely on their home airfield, while American Sabres reluctantly turned back at the river's edge. General Douglas MacArthur, commanding UN forces until his relief in April 1951, had argued repeatedly and publicly for permission to strike Manchurian airfields. President Harry S. Truman refused, fearing escalation into a wider war with China or direct confrontation with the Soviet Union. MacArthur's public defiance of this policy was among the reasons Truman relieved him of command on April 11, 1951, one of the most dramatic civil-military confrontations in American history. Pilots at Kimpo and Suwon Air Base seethed with frustration. Captain Harold Fisher, who would himself be shot down and captured in April 1953, wrote in his diary, "We can see their airfield from the river. We can see their MiGs taking off, and we cannot touch them." It is the most maddening thing I have ever experienced. Asterisk, this political constraint shaped the entire air war, and it is one reason the Soviets lasted as long as they did over MiG Alley. At the highest altitudes over MiG Alley, the air was so thin that pilots teetered on the edge of blackout with every hard maneuver. At 50,000 feet, the sky above turned a deep, airless blue, almost purple, and the curvature of the earth was faintly visible on clear days. Soviet MiG pilots had learned to exploit their superior ceiling advantage, climbing to these extreme altitudes before diving on American formations below. But American pilots had developed a counter. The zoom climb, pulling the Sabres' nose up sharply at transonic speed to briefly achieve altitudes beyond the aircraft's nominal ceiling. In these extraordinary encounters, two jets fighting at the very edge of human endurance, where the physics of the air itself became an enemy, the outcome often came down to a single second of opportunity. Colonel John Glenn, yes, that John Glenn, later to become America's first orbital astronaut, flew F-86 Sabres over Korea in the final weeks of the war. On July 16, 1953, just days before the armistice, Glenn shot down 3 MiGs in 9 days. In a 1999 interview, he recalled, asterisk, at altitude, the controls were so light it felt like flying thought rather than flying metal. One wrong move, and you were in a graveyard spiral with no way out. Asterisk, Glenn survived. Many others did not. Asterisk, the same man who circled Earth in Friendship 7, earned his courage over MiG Alley first. Does that put the space race in a whole new light for you? Asterisk. For nearly 4 decades after the Korean War ended in July 1953, the Soviet pilots who fought over MiG Alley received no official recognition. Their government denied they had even been there. Their families were told to say nothing. Their medals, and they received many, were awarded in secret ceremonies where the citations mentioned no specific location or conflict. Colonel Yevgeny Popelyev returned to the Soviet Union in 1952 with accredited 23 aerial victories, making him arguably the top ace of the Korean Air War by any side's count. He received the Hero of the Soviet Union award in a closed ceremony in Moscow. No press coverage, no parade, no acknowledgement. He was told explicitly, asterisk, you were never in Korea. Asterisk, Popelyev later told a Russian journalist in 1991, after the Soviet archives began to open, asterisk, for 40 years I could not tell my children what I had done or where I had been. That silence was its own kind of wound. Asterisk, his story, and the stories of hundreds of Soviet pilots like him, represent one of the most extraordinary suppressed chapters of Cold War history. These were brave, skilled men who fought hard and died over a country they were officially pretending not to visit. Their bafflement at Sabre performance was real, but so was their courage. And history owes them the acknowledgement that their own government refused to give. One of the most valuable intelligence windfalls of the entire Korean War occurred not in the air, but on the ground, and it came after the armistice. On September 21st, 1953, a North Korean Air Force pilot named No Kum-sok, a 21-year-old lieutenant who had secretly been planning a defection for months, climbed into his MiG-15 bis at Sunan Airfield near Pyongyang, told ground crew he was going on a training flight, and instead flew straight to Kimpo Air Base in South Korea. He landed the MiG perfectly, climbed out, and surrendered. American intelligence officers who arrived at the scene reportedly stood around the intact Soviet jet in stunned silence for several seconds before anyone spoke. No Kum-sok received $100,000 in prize money offered under a classified program called Operation Moolah, which had broadcast radio appeals to communist pilots to defect with their aircraft. The MiG was flown to Okinawa and then to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, where American test pilots, including none other than Major Chuck Yeager, the first man to break the sound barrier, flew it extensively. Yeager's technical report confirmed what combat experience had already suggested. The MiG was faster in the climb, but American pilots had correctly identified and exploited its handling weaknesses. Asterisk, what would you do if you were a young pilot staring at a brand new Soviet jet? Let us know, and subscribe for more incredible declassified history Asterisk. Major Charles Chuck Yeager arrived at Kadena Air Base in October 1953 with the easy confidence of a man who has already broken the sound barrier, which he had, in the Bell X, won on October 14, 1947, over the Mojave Desert. Climbing into the captured MiG-15 bis, Yeager flew a series of evaluation flights designed to systematically probe every corner of the aircraft performance envelope. His findings were revealing. In his written assessment, declassified decades later, Yeager confirmed that the MiG was noticeably superior to the F-86 in zoom climb, initial acceleration, and service ceiling. However, he also noted that at speeds above Mach 0.86, the MiG's ailerons became dangerously heavy and sluggish, making high-speed rolling maneuvers difficult and imprecise. The F-86's hydraulically assisted controls allowed it to roll and turn decisively at speeds where the MiG pilot was essentially wrestling with his aircraft. Yeager wrote, "A pilot who knows these limitations and exploits them at the right moment owns the engagement. A pilot who doesn't know them is in serious trouble." This technical confirmation of what combat experience had already shown served as validation for every Sabre pilot who had survived MiG Alley by instinct and guts alone. The numbers made sense now. The bafflement of Soviet commanders made sense now. The Sabre hadn't simply been lucky. It had been better, in exactly the right ways, at exactly the right moments. At 10:01 a.m. on July 27, 1953, General William K. Harrison Jr. of the United States and General Namail of North Korea signed the Korean Armistice Agreement at a specially constructed building in the village of Panmunjom. The guns fell silent at 10 p.m. that same night. In the air, the last Sabre patrols over MiG Alley turned south and headed home as darkness settled over the Yalu River. The war, at least the shooting part, was over. In 3 years of air combat over Korea, American Sabre pilots had flown 87,177 combat sorties and claimed between 792 and 800 MiG-15 kills against a loss of 78 Sabres in aerial combat, along with additional losses to ground fire and accidents. The 4th and 51st Fighter Interceptor Wings had produced 39 jet aces between them, pilots with 5 or more aerial victories. The Soviet 64th Fighter Aviation Corps, officially non-existent throughout the war, had lost approximately 120 pilots killed, with their exact aircraft losses still debated by historians. For the pilots who had flown it, MiG Alley was not a statistic. It was the most intense, compressed, terrifying, and exhilarating experience of their lives. Many of them would spend the rest of their lives unable to fully explain it to anyone who hadn't been there. The war ended, but the lessons of MiG Alley were only beginning to reshape the future of aerial combat. The lessons of MiG Alley did not stay in Korea. They came home in the flight suits and after-action reports of every pilot who survived, and they fundamentally reshaped American fighter doctrine for the next 20 years. The Air Force established the Fighter Weapons School at Nellis Air Force Base, later to become the legendary Top Gun concept adopted by the Navy, specifically to institutionalize the combat lessons of Korea. The hydraulic flight control advantage that the Sabre possessed over MiG led directly to the design philosophy of the next generation of American fighters, the F-100 Super Sabre, the F-104 Starfighter, and eventually the F-4 Phantom. Ironically, the Air Force also drew the wrong lesson in some respects. Confident that missiles would make guns obsolete in future jet combat, the F-4 Phantom was initially designed without an internal gun. When American pilots over Vietnam in the 1960s found themselves in turning dogfights with nimble North Vietnamese MiG-17s and discovered that their missiles often failed, they paid a steep price for that miscalculation. The Navy's response was a famous Top Gun school established in 1969 to restore the close combat skills that MiG Alley had proven were irreplaceable. Every generation, it seems, must relearn the lesson. Technology alone does not win air superiority. The man in the cockpit still matters most. What do you think? Is the human factor in warfare becoming less important as technology advances, or more important, Drop your thoughts below. Asterisk. The men who flew over MiG Alley scattered after the armistice, carrying the sky with them wherever they went. Joseph McConnell, the top American ace with 16 kills, left the Air Force in 1954 and became a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base in California. On August 25, 1954, barely a year after his last Korean kill, McConnell was killed when his F-86H malfunctioned during a test flight and crashed in the Mojave Desert. He was 30 years old. Pearl McConnell, who had waited for him through every mission over MiG Alley, received the news at their home in Apple Valley. James Jabara, the first American jet ace, continued flying, eventually commanding his own wing. Manuel Fernandez returned to Miami and flew in relative obscurity. John Glenn became an astronaut and a senator. Captain Harold Fisher, shot down and captured in April 1953, spent 2 years and 4 months in a Chinese prison before being released in May 1955, the last American Korean War POW to come home. He had spent those years in solitary confinement, refusing to sign false confessions about germ warfare. On the Soviet side, Yevgeny Popelyev retired from the Air Force in 1961. His Korean service classified. He lived quietly in Moscow, and only in the 1990s was his story finally told. He died in 2013 at the age of 93. Two old pilots, Popelyev and the Americans who face him, never met, but they shared the same sky, and that sky defined them all. Asterisk war is fought by individuals who carry its weight forever. Never forget that. Asterisk. MiG Alley lasted roughly 32 months, from November 1950 to July 1953. In that time, it became the crucible in which the Cold War's air power doctrine was forged, tested, and either proved or broken. Soviet pilots arrived over Korea confident in their aircraft, their experience, and their ideology. They were not fools, and they were not cowards. History must be clear about that. They were highly trained, battle-hardened professionals who flew extraordinary machines with great skill. But the F-86 Sabre, paired with American training philosophy, individual initiative, superior gun sights, hydraulic control advantages, and the kind of audacious aggression that produced men like McConnell and Jabara, tilted the equation in ways Moscow had not anticipated and could not fully correct. The bafflement of Soviet commanders was not a failure of courage. It was a recognition, slow and painful, that air superiority is never simply about the aircraft. It is about the system behind the aircraft, the training culture, the intelligence apparatus, the maintenance crews freezing in Korean winters to keep jets flying, the commanders willing to let young pilots make decisions in the cockpit rather than waiting for orders. MiG Alley proved all of this, and its lessons echo forward through Vietnam, through the Gulf War, through every aerial contest that has followed. Asterisk if this video gave you something to think about. Please hit subscribe for more videos just like this one. We cover the untold stories of history's greatest conflicts with the depth they deserve. Share this with someone who loves aviation history. Leave a question in the comments. We read every one. And remember, the sky remembers every pilot who ever flew through it. Until next time, asterisk.